your invitation and your interests. I'm very happy to present here joint research with two colleagues of mine, Elias, who is a postdoc working on this research project, and Nunung Nuriartono, who is a colleague, a professor of agricultural economics at the University of Bogor, Indonesia. This project is part of a larger collaborative research center, CRC, funded by the German Science Foundation, that is focusing on Sumatra, on the Jambi province in Sumatra, and looks at the ecological and socioeconomic functions of tropical lowland rainforest transformation system, transformation system. So basically, it studies it combines ecologists, natural scientists, economists, agricultural economists who study the transition of land use types in Sumatra, Indonesia, from natural tropical rainforests towards secondary economic activities. And here, for us especially, what we are looking at is the transition towards palm oil or oil palm plantations and palm oil producing activities. So what is our research question in this paper? We are looking at the interaction between two different drivers or mechanisms, political incentives at the local level, and economic, agricultural incentives, market forces, driving deforestation dynamics in Indonesia. And what we are most interested in is actually an interaction between these two forces. So do they reinforce each other, driving deforestation? And just to show you descriptive trends, we are going to look at the 2000s, from 2000 to 2016 in Indonesia. And you see here two different countries, both of them extremely important for their mass of tropical rainforest, Brazil and Indonesia, Brazil green, Indonesia brown. And you see that during this time period, Brazil has been very strongly reducing deforestation rates, which has changed already by now, but that's our period ends in 2017. So Brazil has been actually extremely strongly reducing deforestation, and Indonesia overtook as one of the major global hotspots of deforestation of tropical rainforest around the world. And so we are trying to understand these deforestation dynamics in Indonesia and try to understand how economic incentives together with political incentives drive this. There is a very large literature that we are linking to, and there are many papers that are looking at the role of agricultural incentives in driving deforestation, and they find a lot of effects. So there are different agricultural drivers, cattle, soybean, sugarcane in Brazil. And there is already some evidence on the role of palm oil and timber in Indonesia. And naturally, so many papers find that economic incentives matter, so the larger the expected revenues from natural resources or from agricultural activities that are going to take place at on the newly deforested area, the more deforestation is going to occur. At the same time, there is also a quite large literature looking at political economy factors that are driving deforestation. Different papers looking at the role of corruption and audits or different types of economic policies, and there are 20, 30, 40 papers, and we're just listing a couple. Re-election incentives, but also some policy interventions like naming and shaming, blacklisting district administrations, how all of this affects deforestation. So the first three papers that are listed here, all of them are looking at Brazil, whereas the other two papers are quite well known and are looking at Indonesia. And especially Burgess and Coaters have written a very seminal central paper on this issue, studying the political economy of deforestation in the tropics. And they especially focused on the district proliferation process in Indonesia. So Indonesia, after the end of the Suharto regime, started to decentralize and also democratize strongly, there was a shift towards democracy, and at the same time, a very strong decentralization wave that gave down a lot of decision-making powers to the districts. And by that, there were also very large incentives for new districts to form. So we have seen a very large push towards the creation of new districts. And what Burgess and Coaters have shown is that there is a correlation. So after new districts get created, and the more districts get created, the higher the deforestation. But it's also understandable because natural resource revenues were among one of the factors that were driving deforestation dynamics, not deforestation, sorry, the district split dynamics. So districts wanted to get access to natural resource revenues. That was one of the reasons for them to splitting up. Another paper, so Burgess and Coaters have shown that this formation of new districts have also increased competition for natural resources and has increased deforestation. At the same time, Alazina and Coaters have shown that the same district proliferation process has also resulted in reduced ethnic diversity within each newly formed district that has then acted to reduce or limit deforestation or improve the management of public resources. And again, a second piece of evidence on the effects of political incentives also comes from the Burgess et al. Paper, where they are contrasting two different local electoral regime types in Indonesia. At the beginning, there were elections of local mayors, of local district heads that were by the district parliaments. And from 2005, there was a electoral reform that introduced direct elections. And by that, local local district heads, mayors became directly elected. And in those districts where these direct elections were already introduced, there was an asynchronous process. In those districts, deforestation went up. And that's what Burgess et al. Are documenting at a quite early stage. So how do we enter, how does our paper enter into this discussion? We are looking at a different component of political economy factors that drive deforestation. We are looking at election cycles. And now the literature there is an extremely huge literature on political budget cycles, on election cycles of local or subnational units. And sorry for not citing it, but basically it's really a literature that has been around for more than 20 years. And what it shows is that, especially before elections, local politicians are adjusting their expenditure behavior, they're adjusting their revenue behavior, they're adjusting decisions that they're making politically in order to impress local electorates. So in order to sway elections in their favor. Why would this make any sense, or why could something like this happen? We have to assume somehow that the electorate has imperfect foresight, so can be manipulated by short-term cues, can be manipulated by when in the short run they are observing new signals about what the politicians are doing just before elections. And so, and we are going to look at these electoral cycles, and we are going to link these electoral cycles to also economic incentives. And especially we are going to look at interactions with economic incentives, a very specific type of economic incentives especially, which is going to be palm oil induced variation in these, or like, is going to be driven by the local expected revenues from producing palm oil. What are the potential mechanisms? So why would an electoral cycle potentially arise also in terms of deforestation? First of all, you could, so if there are some, if we believe that local constituencies actually respond to politicians' signals, then politicians may want to really do stuff differently just before elections. They may want, in order to signal their economic competence. So basically, they could start promoting agricultural production. They could start giving out more subsidies, or just trying to basically heat up the local economy in order to have better chances at re-election. That's one type of explanation. A different type of explanation could be if politicians also gather resources from deforestation. How could that happen? Either legally by selling licenses, or also illegally by getting or corruption-related revenues from the process of land use transition. And so if politicians need such revenues to fund their re-election campaigns, that's also something that could be could become much more important right before elections. And the third, more innocuous type of explanation could be that if the local administration is focusing on implementing local elections, then any type of administrative oversight is getting costlier. So there may be just an increase in illegal deforestation just because politicians are actually focusing on elections and not on anything else. How are we going to address these issues? Our research approach is going to rely on a panel of Indonesian districts over 16 years. So we are going to look at spatial temporal data, and we are going to try to get or gather as much information or distill as much information from observable satellite data as we can. And we are going to look at the location of forest losses, also the type of forest losses. And we are going to utilize district elections, which have been nicely for us, quasi-randomly timed in Indonesia. So Indonesia is one of the countries where local elections over the last 20 years have not been happening in a synchronous manner, but actually where their timing was historically determined. So by that, each district had an idiosyncratic election cycle that we can really nicely identify, and we can link it to deforestation outcomes. We are going to combine it with economic incentives that we are going to measure by price fluctuations of agricultural commodities, and we are going to bring that down to the local level by looking at crop suitability. So we are going to look at the district's agricultural suitability towards producing certain agricultural products. And our main findings, what they're going to show is that these economic and political incentives are actually strongly reinforcing each other. So political budget cycles are being reinforced when the economic returns to agricultural transition or to change in land use are expected to be larger. What type of data are we using? We are looking at, or we are using satellite-based measures of deforestation over time from the Global Forest Cover Database, based on very high resolution raster data, and focusing on initial forest and changes then in this initial forest, where initial forest is defined by areas where canopy density is at least 30%. And then we are going to look at the yearly variation in this forest loss. So here you see Indonesia and the different islands of Indonesia and the forest cover in 2000 as compared to the forest cover in 2016, or even better, here you see the newly deforested area, which is mostly or concentrated on two main islands in the northwest, Sumatra, which is also the focus of the Collaborative Research Center, and in the north, Kalimantan. We are transforming this data into district level deforestation measures, again from 2001 to 2016, you see it here. Why? Because our units of analysis or where the decisions are made are actually the districts. So basically the political agents are acting at the district level. And so we are calculating everything and transforming very high resolution data to the district level. We're also going to look at monthly fire data. I'm just going to show you one result based on that. But again, we are transforming monthly forest fire, daily forest fires, aggregating them to monthly and transforming it again into district level variation in intensity of forest fires across time. And this is going to help us to zoom in also in terms of the timing of variation. When does deforestation happen? Since deforestation data refers to always just changes from one year to another, more precisely timed forest fires can actually help us to measure when was deforestation happening, since forest fires play a central role in clearings. Economic incentives, as I said, we are going to measure them by agricultural incentives. And agricultural incentives, they are going to be composed from two parts. One of them is the spatial variation in agricultural incentives, so that's time invariant. The spatial variation is going to rely on FAO data on the global agroecological zones, which you see here, for instance, that's the suitability for oil palm production. So those areas that are green show the highest suitability to produce oil palm and show the highest yields, highest potential yields to produce oil palm. Again, we are going to transform this data or aggregate this data at the district level. We are going to combine this time invariant suitability, which is going to give us basically a local determinant of potential economic or incentives. We are going to combine it with price variation in order to get a measure that is fluctuating over time. And so here you see in the formula, S is going to be suitability of any crop C in district D. We are going to multiply it by a common price variation in year T, again, of a crop C. What are, how are we measuring this price variation? We are comparing each year's global market prices with what was, with the average of prices over the last 5 years. We are standardizing this measure. So here you see a time series on global agricultural crop prices. Black is palm oil, and behind that there are a lot of gray lines of 10 additional main crops of Indonesia. You see prices have been increasing, fluctuating a bit, but increasing until 2018. And then there was a switch and palm oil prices started to decrease. One important thing to keep in mind or consider is that when we are taking global market price trends, these are actually not completely exogenous to what is happening in Indonesia. So on an aggregate level, Indonesia is driving actually global market prices. Not entirely, of course, there's also a global demand. So 2008, the financial crisis and demand slumps must have also contributed to these price dynamics. But Indonesia is one of the main palm oil producers together with Malaysia, and because of that, when Indonesia starts to expand palm oil production, it's going to put a downward pressure on prices. Because of this, we are actually going to estimate lower bound of economic incentives, because from the aggregate perspective, prices are actually driven by what Indonesia is doing on the aggregate. And in order to show you then an upper bound, I'm also going to show you some instrumental variable results where we are instrumenting this global price trend by variation in trading partners, GDP levels over the years. From the policy, how do we measure the policy environment? Our main variable is going to be the timing of local elections, local mayoral elections. So these are bupatis, wali kotas, so it's been heads of local governments. And we are looking at the timing of their, when these elections occurred. There is a 5-year electoral cycle, and the cycle has been determined historically. So there were mayors who have been appointed earlier or later at the time of the democratic transition, and all mayors were allowed to spend their 5 years, finish their 5 years, their 5-year period, and elections were only instituted afterwards. Because of that, there is a very large component of idiosyncratic variations. You see a lot of elections happening in different years. Additionally, there has been a shift, a regime change, as I said already. There was a shift from indirect elections towards direct elections in 2005. Earliest for those, or in the following years, in those districts that were electing their mayors a year later than 2005. Okay, how are we going to estimate these models? We are going to run very simple panel data regressions where we are basically utilizing the quasi-exogeneity of elections timing in order to identify effects of the electoral cycle on deforestation and interactions. Our dependent variable is going to be deforestation, newly deforested area in any district D in year T. We are going to take an inverse hyperbolic sign transformation. Our main explanatory variable you see here in blue, it's going to be election timing. So whether an election in district D is going to happen in this year, next year, or year before, 2 years ago. What are we controlling for? First sample and clustering. Our sample, we are limiting our sample to districts that started with a substantial forest cover. Why are we doing this? Because otherwise we are diluting a lot. So if we are including too many districts that had almost no forest cover at the beginning, and then following them for 16 years, there is nothing going to happen in those districts. So by that we would be diluting our results. So we decided to restrict our sample to initially forested districts. That's actually quite usual in panel data analysis of deforestation. So here I'm showing you results with a cut at a 40% initial forest cover, but the results are quite robust to how exactly this forest cover is decided. So we have 16 years and 397 districts that fulfill this initial requirement. We are clustering at the level of original parent districts, since, as I said, districts started to split up and there were many new districts forming. We are clustering everything back, allowing correlations at the parent district level from the beginning. We are controlling for a couple of important things. We are controlling for this endogenous district splitting process in these control variables XDT. And quite substantial or quite extensively, we are setting up time dummies for each district, mothers and children separately, if they are going to split in 2 years' time, 1 year time, this year, have split last year, 2 years ago. By that, we are trying to pick up any potential differences in dynamics that can somehow be linked back to the district splitting process. We are not focusing on this process, but we are controlling for it. And also importantly, we are also controlling for differential trends by the initial forest size and soil suitability. So basically we allow for districts to be on very different deforestation paths over time, depending on their original suitability for palm oil production or oil palm agricultural growth, or initial forest size. Why are we doing this? Because especially our economic incentive variables are going to explicitly utilize this time invariant component. And in order to make sure that this time invariant local characteristic is not somehow just correlated to some spurious trends and just picking up other urbanization dynamics, location-specific development dynamics, we are allowing for differential trends. Additionally, we are controlling for district fixed effects, so taking out everything that is time invariant and district specific, and time fixed effects, so taking out everything that is common and happens in all Indonesian districts all the time. We can do this exactly just because the electoral timing process is district year specific, so because there is an asynchronous way of timing elections in Indonesia. Additionally, when we are focusing on interaction effects, we are actually going to just look at the pre-election year, and I'm going to show you why we are doing that, because the pre-election year is going to be the one that's really driving all our results. And additionally, we are going to control for palm oil price exposure that I explained before, so it's going to be local agroclimatic suitability condition interacted with price variation. And by that, we are basically capturing how much a district should be exposed to price incentives that arise from rising palm oil prices over time or falling palm oil prices over time. And the assumption behind that is that districts that are especially suitable for palm oil production are going to be the ones that are going to respond more strongly to price incentives. Here, our focus is mainly, our focus is going to be mainly on the interaction between the two. So the palm oil price exposure measure interacted with the pre-election year indicator. But I'm going to show you all the time 3 coefficients on election timing, on palm oil price exposure and their interaction. And the controls are the same as I introduced on the slide before. So all this said, let's look at results. First of all, what you see here is variation over time in deforestation and in fires. In terms of deforestation, you see T is the election year. So T-1, T-2, and T+1, all of them are compared to a baseline year of T-3. Here you don't see anything significant, but that's just because of our lack of power as in comparison to T-3. What actually comes out if we start controlling for just the pre-election year is that all years are similar, but the pre-election year shows higher deforestation. And that's also something you should see already roughly in this figure, see that the pre-election year really looks somewhat different. If you are looking at quarterly variation, which we can do because the fires data is of a much higher frequency, we still aggregate it a bit. So here it's the quarterly election timing results. QT is just when the election is taking place. You see that about 1 year before, 3 to 4 quarters before the elections are taking place, that's the time when when there is a substantial increase in forest fires on the district areas. Why is it so? Most elections actually take place in the summer. So since fires are also taking place in the summer months, I'm now taking a northern hemisphere perspective. So summer is basically just months June to August. That's where local elections mostly take place, but it's also where forest fires are very strongly clustering. And you see that about 1 year before that, 3 to 4 quarters before that, that's when forest fires are at their highest. So in the pre-election year, if you want to translate it, it translates to about 4.5% higher deforestation, to about 4% more forest fires, or about more than 2,000 square kilometers excess forest loss, or 1,400 additional forest fires measured over this time period. And now to our interaction. So what you can see here are the 3 main coefficients where everything is controlled for, as I said before. So you see a coefficient on the pre-election year. You see a coefficient on the palm oil price exposure, so basically economic incentives, and a coefficient on the interaction of both. And pre-election year is marginally not significant. It's positive-ish. I'm going to show you in a second that in itself, it would be still significant. Just when the interaction is added, it loses its significance. The palm oil price exposure is also positive and significant. So basically before elections, there is somewhat more deforestation. When prices are high and in places that are more suitable for palm oil or oil palm, growing oil palm, also is linked to higher deforestation. And when these 2 conditions coincide, it's increasing deforestation even further. So just to show you regression results at least once, I'm usually hiding them, but here they are. So here you see the pre-election year coefficient, district and year fixed effects are controlled for all the time. And at the beginning, we are not adding further controls, especially not differential trends. In the last 2 columns, we are adding also differential trends and then interactions. And what you see is pre-election years in themselves show higher deforestation. Palm oil price exposure also is linked to higher deforestation. And these 2, that's also due to the quasi-exogenous nature of the pre-election year, that if you are controlling for both, nothing changes. So they are really distinctly identified, these 2 coefficients. Now, if we are controlling also for the initial conditions time and allowing for differential trends across all districts, this is actually going to make the pre-election year coefficient lose its significance on the margin. But more importantly, our interaction when we are adding it is still highly significant. So basically, in exactly these two driving factors are clearly reinforcing each other. So politics and economics go hand in hand. Both of them matter, but they matter even more when these incentives coincide. that's basically our main result. And now what we are going to try to do is to look at different channels, or try to mine as much this result as possible to understand, is it really something that is driven by our incentives? Is it really something that is deforestation related? Not deforestation, but palm oil related? Can we be sure that it's really what we are measuring is not spurious, but actually really coming from the story that we are trying to tell? Okay, so that's just before going into that, just very quickly, if we are doing the IV, where we are instrumenting prices with trading partner GDP, we are overestimating potentially our effect, because we are not shutting off other channels. So we do not necessarily believe in an IV in this setting, but it just shows you that the coefficients increase about threefold, or and by that, before we have estimated most likely a lower bound effect. If you are comparing now palm oil to other crops, and we were looking at each crop also separately one by one, or just combining other crop price exposure into a composite measure, you see that controlling for other prices for other crops is not going to take away the palm oil interaction. And more specifically, other crops are also not linked to the political process in the same way. So palm oil seems to play really a central role in the Indonesian political economy of deforestation. If we are comparing now direct and indirect elections, here you see basically splitting up elections, whether they were happening before 2005 or after 2005. We are very strongly lacking power here for the early elections. There are fewer observations, but there is no indication that that our results would be driven by indirect elections. So elections where local mayors were not individually running, but rather were appointed by local parliaments, and the very precisely estimated coefficients on the interaction are coming from especially direct mayoral elections. So when mayors actually started to run for elections themselves and became directly elected. When we are comparing first and second term mayors, we are trying to understand whether there is a lame duck type of effect, because in Indonesia, mayors are only allowed to stay for 2 terms. So the second term mayor would be facing different political incentives. Again, we may lack power potentially, because we may mismeasure second term mayors. It's based on some internet research, and because of that, we are not so entirely sure in these results, but we don't see at least any significant difference between the behavior of first and second term mayors. So second term mayor interactions are never significant. And now the very last chunk, so I'm coming to an end. I still have a couple of minutes. So the very last chunk of our results, we are trying now to look more for heterogeneity, so try to understand what type of deforestation is it really that's happening. So we are going to focus on the land use dynamics themselves. So for instance, we can distinguish on which type of areas is deforestation happening. So we can distinguish areas by their ecological zones. There are different types of zones within Indonesia. They are classified as lowland, upland, so low and high, montane areas, wetland, peatland, primary forest. What you see here is, for instance, wetland. Wetland and lowland are the most agriculturally promising areas. And if you look here at coefficients, what you see here now is coefficients split by ecological area type. And the green ones, the first one is always the pre-election coefficient, the second one is the price exposure coefficient, and the third one is the interaction, also colored in green. So I'm just going to focus on the interaction. You see that the interaction is especially large in wetland, the one figure I was showing before, but also quite large in lowland areas. So it's strongly driven by prime agricultural areas, basically. We can also identify oil palm plantations based on work by others who were looking at satellite data and satellite imagery and coding it. Since palm oil plantations, or oil palm plantations look very, very distinct from above, from satellite images, they have been coded using machine learning algorithms for the years 2000, 2005, 2010, and 15 here. And so we are going to look at whether deforestation was happening at areas that have been coded later as oil palm growing areas. And what you see here is distinguishing between areas, what they ended up looking like in 2015. So non-oil palm areas, oil palm areas, or areas that were oil palm from to begin with. So even in 2000, you had some oil palm areas. This third coefficient is basically something like a placebo test for us. Because if you find deforestation on areas that actually were oil palm from the beginning, that's not really truly deforestation. It's just potentially replanting. So trees get cut, oil palm trees, so it's secondary, it's not even forest, but it's basically oil palm plantation could be cut and replanted. And we would also think that this is actually deforestation. And that's not what's driving our results at all. So our placebo is very close to zero, whereas those areas that are going to be converted to oil palm areas by 2015 are the ones that are most strongly driven by this interaction between political and economic variables. But also non-oil palm areas are also responding. So it's not like incentives that we measure that are driving oil palm and necessarily are going to result immediately in areas that are also oil palm areas. It could be that they are actually still result in some transitional type of forest areas or shrubland, and that's going to be converted only later. And now we can also, that's basically the first three coefficients are just these green interaction coefficients once again repeated. The second three, we can also look at how long did it take to actually convert this forest into an oil palm plantation, and especially in those areas where there was a very short-term conversion between observed deforestation and then oil palm plantations are the ones that are driven by our economic political interactions. So in a sense, again, it's just a sensibility check that is showing you that exactly the type of mechanisms that we are linking to deforestation dynamics are the ones that are happening also mostly in the very short run, are driving immediate deforestation. And the very last step is we're also looking at concessions. So how do policymakers do this? So in which steps do they achieve? So is it basically illegal deforestation that gets legalized somewhere later or doesn't even get legalized later by agricultural concessions? Or is it just agricultural concessions that are responding to these incentives? And for that, we are using concession data, spatial concession data by type, palm oil concessions, logging and timber concessions. And just one result on this, we really don't see substantial differences across different types of concession areas. So again, these green interaction coefficients show you that basically all of them are the same. So the dynamics are very similar on areas that are becoming non-concession areas, that are becoming concession areas, or that are for oil palm or other timber and logging. And if you are looking at the dynamics of how new concession areas are established, they are actually not being established before elections. So before elections, deforestation happens. Concession areas are more likely to be established only after elections. So it really looks like an ex post legalization process. And that's also something that is opening us new questions to study, is exactly to understand this process, how ex post legalization is going to happen. So let me come very close to conclusion. So we basically find an election cycle, and we see that palm oil prices and elections both contribute to deforestation in Indonesia. They are reinforcing each other, are mirrored in forest fires. At least the election cycle is mirrored in forest fires. From the political perspective, we see that direct elections are more important here, but again, we lack power to neatly disentangle the two. And licenses increase after elections, not before. So by that, we see some ex post adjustments. From the land use dynamics type, it's mostly high value areas that are responding, and these new industrial oil palm plantations are the ones that are responding very strongly. And so just a very short outlook, we are within this collaborative research center, we are working on a series of different related topics. We are looking at social opinion processes, using geo-localized Twitter data to understand how social opinion processes evolve in the face of elections, but also fire and haze. We are looking at the district splitting process and trying to understand whether these slumps in administrative capacity that I was referring to at the beginning could also be explaining somehow parts of this deforestation dynamics, and for which we are doing spatial RDD at newly instituted borders and around left and right borders. And we are also looking at the role of FDI regulation, as the palm oil sector has been regulated over time in Indonesia, and looking at geolocalized plant data to understand how regulation and regulatory interventions contributed or reduced deforestation. By that, thank you very much for your long attention, and I hope I have still left a couple of minutes for questions.
Thanks, thanks, Christina. Thank you very much. Folks, questions, comments, suggestions? As I said, you can use the Q&A or chat facilities, or you can also raise your hand in Zoom. Okay, usually I start with a couple of questions and then they come. So I was thinking about the mayors. How much power do they actually have in influencing policy?
Mayors have quite a lot of power, but their power has been changing very substantially as well. So especially at the very beginning, in the first years after 2000, local districts started to sell legally deforestation licenses big time. So at the very beginning, in the first couple of years after 2000, there was really a licensing bonanza, basically, where local administrations started to really generate resources by that, which the center didn't like that much. So over time, there have been actually substantial reforms and trying to re-centralize this environmental regulation or environmental regulatory process. So that by now, mayors are not making decisions on their own anymore, but it's a decision-making process where the center and the local governments are jointly involved. So there is rather a local support that is needed for central decisions, but still corruption at local level does exist and is extremely pervasive. So it's also something that is certainly factors in which we are, in a sense, we are not really able to distinguish, right? So it's really a smoking gun type of analysis where you don't know who does exactly what. So it's not necessarily illegal deforestation. Part of it is just legal transition of land use. But of course, you see, for instance, from the fact that licenses come after, whereas deforestation comes before, that not everything is completely just by the foreseen political or policy-making process.
So there are two other questions here. I will read them for you. How would you have explored the correlation between the effect splitting of districts process as they affect the deforestation process if you are not using it as a control?
I'm using it as a control all the time. So basically, we are just to show you back the regressions here, or let's put it here, let's say. These are our main regressions. In the X vector, we are basically controlling for about 6 to 8 indicator variables that measure whether a district is going to split up in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time, in 1 year time this year, or has split up in the past. And by that, and also distinguishing between a mother and a child, because even there, it could be different incentives. Because for a mother, for instance, the incentive could be to exploit the resources of the child as soon as the split has been decided on, because they may know that 2 years later, that's actually not going to be already their revenue anymore. And so there is a very potentially asymmetric process. And so what the only thing that we are doing, we are controlling for this whole district splitting process very minutely in a sense, but without really trying to give it an interpretation. We have also been looking at interactions with this process and all our variables of interest, especially political variables, but it's getting oversaturated. So we don't see anything, nothing is significant there. So in a sense, we couldn't really find nicely differential results by the splitting up process. But I just wanted to say that in a sense, it's also good to be cautious because the splitting process, the timing of splits, there have been a couple of moratoria, 2 major moratoria, but the timing of the splitting process has been certainly not exogenous.
There is another question here, Christina. Ecological zones, don't they indicate proliferation of forests to start off with? So palm oil prices or elections will have a effect mainly there as opposed to zones where there is no forestation?
In a sense of, like, So I don't know whether your question is whether ecological zones are correlated with palm oil suitability. In a sense, first of all, the different agricultural suitabilities, I don't have now nice maps on other crops, but basically different agricultural suitabilities are quite nicely non-overlapping. So it's not like those areas that are the best for palm oil production are also best for any type of production or agricultural production of oil palm or other crops. But of course, there is certainly a certain type of correlation. So when we start splitting up this area, we are basically, so still what we are doing is very, very fine. So here we are aggregating at the district level. So our suitability measure is just an intensity indicator that goes from highly suitable to very lowly suitable. But when we are looking at ecological zones, these ecological zones could be different within the same district. So you could, because there is a large difference, for instance, in elevation, then you could go from lowland to highland to montane within the same one. And then what we are doing is we are looking at each pixel and saying, okay, so on this pixel, this is now within the same district, but this is now a montane pixel in that district. Was deforestation happening in this one? Or was deforestation happening on a pixel that belonged to a different ecological zone? So in that sense, we are able to differentiate quite precisely between very exactly does deforestation happen after all. But if you say, yes, certain types of ecological zones are going to be more suitable for palm oil, you are absolutely right, of course. So here you see that suitability is strongly green on the eastern part of Sumatra, for instance. And if you look at the wetland areas, again, they're also very strongly focusing on the eastern part of Sumatra. So sure, there is a substantial overlap in high productivity and for instance, here wetland areas. So these two things do not contradict each other. It's rather like a consistency check, if you want to say, so do we really observe deforestation there where economically we would think that it should be happening? So in a sense, you could also say it's not a very revolutionary results, of course not, but it's just a sensibility check.
So there is another question here which I can answer. Where can we read the study? So the working paper is available from ERSA's website. And then there is a question, are the main results obtained through IV or fixed effects only?
No, all results that I have shown you are fixed effect results. And I can also tell you why, because basically the one thing that we are instrumenting for, so instrument is rather like a consistency check for us. Why is it so? Because the one thing that could be endogenous in this whole story, this could be the price variation. Why? Because when Indonesia started to expand palm oil production very substantially, it actually put a downward pressure on prices. So here, there has been a very strong expansion of palm oil production and oil palm producing areas. At the same time, so Indonesia was basically pushing down incentives. And by that, when you are taking this decreasing incentives in order to explain increasing deforestation, you are underestimating potentially the effect. So we feel much better at underestimating this effect than the other way around if we overestimated it. And so then our coefficients will be coming somehow from inflated effects. So what are we doing? How we are how are we instrumenting for prices? We then take GDP of trading partner countries and weight them by initial importance of these trading partner countries as export markets for Indonesian crops. It's not only oil palm, or palm oil, but actually Indonesian crops on average. And then look at how much did their GDP change over years. Now, what is the problem there? We are violating an exclusion restriction. Why? Because by that we are assuming that global GDP fluctuations affect deforestation only through palm oil, which is actually not true. It also affects deforestation through cocoa, and bananas and all other important crops. But as we have seen, actually, the other crops play a minor role. So in a sense, when we are using an IV, we are overestimating potentially the importance of palm oil. We are just doing this in order to somehow show a bound. How much would it be if we are overestimating it? whereas the underestimation is the one that we are really preferring throughout the paper.
And there is another question here, Christina, which is essentially about the role of urbanization. Do you control for that, for instance?
Not at all, in a sense. So, but if you think, okay, how we think about this is that urbanization could be one of the mechanisms. So, in a sense, transformation of forest into agricultural production is also going to strengthen urbanization dynamics. In order to control for that, what we are, well, not control, but basically roughly proxy for that, what we are doing is we are taking the share of initial forest, so how much forest was there at the beginning, and interacting with it at a time trend. So by that, we are seeing that very highly forested areas are actually the ones that are not going to be on a very quick deforestation dynamic, and are not going to be on a very quick urbanization dynamic either, which is true because those areas that had about 100 to 90% forest cover are the ones that are responding to economic incentives the least because they are the most remote. So those are going to be on a different dynamic than those that had relatively higher and higher, or relatively lower and lower initial forest coverage. So if I'm searching a bit, but if I find these results by not canopy density, but initial forest cover. So if you see that if we are including those districts that had zero initial forest cover, then actually our interaction coefficient vanishes. But then again, we are not so much disturbed by it because it's very hard to measure deforestation dynamics on places that have had zero forest to begin with. And as soon as we allow for basically any, at least 10% initial forest cover, our effects actually increase. On the other hand, if we were now focusing only on those places that were initially fully forested, so 100%, 90% forest cover, again, our results would also become insignificant because these are places high up in the mountains where still deforestation is not present. So deforestation is going happening step by step. It's a very spatial process. It's happening on the margins. The same what you see in Brazil. There is a deforestation arc that is eating into the Brazilian Amazon rainforest. Here in Indonesia, the deforestation is a bit more spatially distributed, but again, you have like spatial processes that are basically here from the south of Kalimantan eating into the forest, and here from the east of Sumatra going up the mountains. So here what you have here is a mountain range basically. So again, deforestation is enough following a line meaningfully, like a spatial process going from places that are close to cities, as you say, urbanization dynamic, towards places that are used to be very, very remote.
I was also thinking in terms of the districts themselves, the local finances of those districts, do they matter? Because I just wonder if a particular district has a surplus, right? Do you control for that? Does it matter or not at all?
We are, in a sense, district finances are, again, we are not controlling for this because they could be much more endogenous, but Indonesian decentralization has been very specific in that sense from a fiscal perspective, because it was basically an expenditure decentralization and not so much a revenue decentralization. So because of that, there is a formula-based fiscal system that gives districts their budgets based on needs, like on formula-based needs, plus a bit on natural resources. But because of that, it's a centralized allocation of funds. So a district cannot manage that easily its own surplus or deficit in that sense, because the budget is to a large extent given.
Okay, all right. And I was also thinking, Christina, what about demand for land itself? It seems that there is a lot of demand for land.
Sure.
Yeah, so how can you actually control for that? Does it matter if particular districts have higher rates of unemployment, for instance, and these people try to get jobs in the agricultural sector?
Okay, so it's also an interesting question, especially in a sense, we are looking at a demand-driven dynamic, right? Just the demand is global profitability for agricultural production that is going to feed into demand for land. But there are also quite a couple of papers looking at this from a labor market perspective and looking at just linking this palm oil expansion to what is happening at the labor market. And it's quite interesting because at the labor market, there is a certain type of substitution of labor because palm oil is much less labor intensive. So oil palm production is much less labor intensive than other productions. So for instance, in Jambi, it's somewhere here where the whole CRC is located, the other main economic activity used to be rubber production. And rubber, natural rubber needs much more checking, a lot of manual labor, more workers, whereas an oil palm plantation is actually quite less labor intensive. So what this expansion of oil palm production also does is potentially reducing the demand for labor in certain parts of districts. Of course, if it's newly generated agricultural activity, as opposed to what there was, as opposed to forest and zero economic activity, then it's going to increase demand for workers. But there is also a very strong substitution towards less labor-intensive production.
And there is one more question here, Christina. Have you also considered population growth over time?
We have not looked at population growth, but it could be just, for instance, all of these socioeconomic dynamics are for us, in a sense, outcomes. So it would be interesting to look at, as far as I know, I haven't seen anything. In a sense, population growth would be changing because of fertility and migration.
Yes. And
we don't know very much. I cannot recall any paper that would be linking either fertility or migration to this, but certainly, so it does have all this land use transition dynamic has a very strong consequences for a lot of socioeconomic outcomes. It's not only poverty and education and labor markets, but a lot of connected dynamics and outcomes.
Okay, thank you, thanks, Christina. Thank you all for taking part. Christina, let me thank you again for taking part and for accepting coming here and talking to us.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to all the participants. And please bear in mind that I am stopping recording this now.